Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
The job I am after belongs currently to Liz Truss, and I'd just say to her, don't get too comfortable.
Hello listeners and welcome to Chopper's Politics. I'm Christopher Hope, the chief political correspondent at the Daily Telegraph. Now our shy and retiring Prime Minister has been causing a big stir in the Big Apple this week. So I'll be taking stock on how Boris Johnson did in his first big major overseas trip of his premiership with former Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt. He'll be telling me whether he thinks the PM was right to tell the French to prenez un grip over this new nuclear submarine deal with Australia, the US and the UK. And Boris Johnson might have tried to leave behind his Brexit woes on his trip to America. But US President Joe Biden was having none of that when they met in Washington. And I'll be picking up on Joe Biden's comments with Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, for whom this Northern Ireland Protocol is an existential issue that must be gripped. But first, it's a big week for Sir Keir Starmer. He just published an 11,500-word treatise, and this weekend he'll try and push through big changes to the way the party elects future leaders. Moderate supporters of Labour hope this might be the end of its lurch to the left. So ahead of this weekend, I spoke to Wigan MP and Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy. Lisa Nandy, welcome to Chopper's Politics. Great to have you on.
Oh, thanks for having me, I think.
Come on, don't be nervous. Now listen, Keir Starmer just published his 11,500-word Fabian essay on the road ahead for the Labour Party. What have you learnt from this essay?
Well, I feel cheated, first of all, because I was led to believe it was 14,000 words. I read it yesterday, and obviously I've been discussing it with him for some time because it's based on the trip that he did over the summer where he went out and spent time with people in lots of different communities in the UK, including a number around here near Wigan. He went to Blackpool, didn't bring me any rock back, but he did he did bring back a lot of stories, and he also brought back a real sense of where the country needs to be and what they want from their government. Not just investment, but actually a real sense of belonging and rootedness. For a lot of people, I think they look at the current settlement and just feel, what is my place in it? What is the future for my town, for my village, for my city? They want their children to be able to grow up in the places that they were born and to be able to stay and make a contribution. And that point about contribution, that sense of pride and rootedness and purpose, something that I understand really well, because here in Wigan, within living memory, we powered the world through work in the coal mines. And although you don't find many people who want to reopen the mines, they don't want that future for their children or their grandchildren. They do want a better future than just minimum wage, insecure work, delivery driver work or working in a call centre. They want to know that they can be part of building the future of this country. And we've got to show that we're the party that can help them to realise those ambitions, not to tell them what their own aspirations are, which we've done so many times in the past, but actually to help them realise their own aspirations.
You mentioned investment there, and that is what levelling up is meant to mean. Although I should tell you, I did ask the government what levelling up meant. I asked the Department of Levelling Up what levelling up meant, and they couldn't answer for 7 hours on Tuesday. They gave me an answer finally, an 83-word answer, along with 400 words of background notes. So before the Tories start criticising Labour for being self-indulgent in writing a long, big piece about what should be a simple answer on what Labour stands for, they can't tell me what levelling up means easily. Putting that to one side, you mentioned the word investment there, and surely that's what levelling up means. I mean, they are just chucking money, aren't they, at red wall northern seats, and all Labour can do is watch as the money's being spent.
I sort of laughed slightly when you said they can't tell you what it means, but actually I think it's tragic. For the last few years, I've spent most of my time, a lot of it on the back benches, trying to work out how we deliver on the ambition that people have. I think in Westminster, often we look at places like Wigan and we see them for the problems that they pose rather than the potential that they have. The anger in towns like mine towards politicians of all political persuasions has come from the fact that people are ambitious for their areas. They know that things can be better. They're hopeful, they're optimistic, but they don't see that matched by people in Westminster, and they don't see political parties with a plan to do it. It's one of the things that Keir is trying to set right. The money that has come to us as part of this so-called levelling up agenda, it's been really quite limited in its scope and ambition. We've had these little pots of money to try to help the decline of our high streets. We've had to fight one another for pots of money to try to get investment and regeneration projects up and running. The government's been absolutely clear with us that we should make sure that we only invest in projects that they call shovel ready, which basically replicates the problem that we've had in this country for decades, because those areas where there's already some infrastructure are the areas where you get more bang for your buck, you get greater productivity if you invest. And this is how some places have pulled further and further ahead while others have fallen further and further behind. It feels to me that they are repeating every mistake in the book. Now, maybe that changes with Michael Gove, and maybe particularly now that they've given a role to someone like Neil O'Brien, who actually is much more thoughtful about these things. Maybe that changes, but I don't really see it changing unless Number 10 understand what it is that people are asking for. And I don't think this Prime Minister really does understand that when people say they want change in their lives, they don't want somebody riding in from Whitehall to tell them what that change looks like.
So for Labour, would levelling up mean levelling up with knobs on? I mean, levelling up to 11 on the Speaker, if Spinal Tap. Is that what it'd be? It'd be a lot more money being spent because you're fighting over cash for high streets and it's quite marginal, the money you're describing there, isn't it?
In my mind, it means three things. First of all, it means investment, but investment in the right things. We've got to create the conditions in which the assets that we have in our areas can be realised. So Grimsby is a really good example of this, where, during the leadership contest, I went to see people working still in the fishing industry. And when I was there, the guy said to me, "Why aren't you down there?" And he pointed down the road. He said, "If you want to look at, what's happening here, the wind industry has been one of the most exciting developments that they've seen." The government's own report published recently showed that it has lifted the number of people off benefits by 60% in the last 10 years because they're employing local people to actually drive the jobs of the future, the energy needs of the future. This is the sort of investment that we need. So we need investment, but the right investment. We need proper partnerships. Stop pitting areas against one another. It's not in Wigan's interest to see Lee decline, and it's not in Lee's interest to see Wigan decline. Let us work together to solve these problems. I don't think this government has any real sense that what people are asking for is not just our fair share of investment. We want real power to make those decisions for ourselves. We know better than Whitehall the problems that we have, and we also know better than Whitehall how to solve them.
Just going back on Keir Starmer's essay, he talks about how Labour should be proudly patriotic and reject the divisiveness of nationalism. And you talked before about bunting and why bunting matters. But bunting is great. I'm from the north as well. I love bunting. But it does illustrate pride in a community, doesn't it? And you think that's what maybe Labour lost under Jeremy Corbyn?
Actually, I think this is a much longer term thing. Years ago, when I was a fairly newly elected MP, I gave a speech about patriotism and the left. And the reason that I did it is because I just felt there was something so strange about how the right had appropriated this concept of patriotism. And in the last few years, we've seen it sort of collapse into kind of, how many flags can you have on display? Ministers rushed to the chamber when they were still wearing face masks with flags emblazoned all over them, trying to sort of show how patriotic they were. But actually, there's a quiet patriotism that exists across this country that is a real force for good. It's one of the greatest assets that we've got. I mean, I know we joke about bunting, but I interrupted a call with the UK ambassador to the United States a while ago to go and join a VE Day party in my street. We're bunting out everywhere and people were having a great time, but we were also doing what we do best here in Wigan. We were pulling together as a community. We may not have big economic assets, but we have huge social assets. And actually, through austerity, that is what has kept us going. The Wigan Council launched something called The Deal, and it was about how we were going to cope with the massive cuts to our local budget. And it meant that people stepped up. The council said, "We'll do what you need." So the people said, "Keep the libraries open. We don't want you to sell them off." So they did, but in return, we had local people volunteering to run them. If you walk down the street here at the weekend, you'll find people mowing the grass verges because the council doesn't have the funding to do it.
That sounds like the big society and old money, doesn't it, Lisa Nandy?
Well, the big society was one of the most interesting concepts, I think, that has happened in politics. But under George Osborne, it collapsed into a kind of shrink the state agenda. But if you read Jesse Norman's book about it, he talks about those institutions, those community institutions that help to shape and define us, he says, as we help to shape and define them. I think there's an element of the Conservative Party that understands this. It's not the one that's in charge at the moment. But there also ought to be an element of the Labour Party that understands that when people, when they go off and fight for their country, they're doing so because they believe in something bigger than themselves, and that matters.
Why do you think, though, that Keir Starmer his party's becalmed on around 33%? Why can't the Labour Party cut through against the Tories? Why can't they go talk a lot about 11 years of failure in the same way the Tory party was doing to us journalists back in the late noughties about the Labour government?
Well, first of all, I don't think many people really do see Boris Johnson as a continuation of the last 11 years. I think he's defined himself very much against his party for his entire career. And although he's been in every division lobby voting through the same Conservative policies as Theresa May and David Cameron, he's defined himself, I think, in the public mind as a break with that tradition. And
but why can't Keir make any ground on that? Why can't he make that point and show the fact we have got 11 years of the same people running the country, although a different Prime Minister?
I think we are. I think we do. And actually, I don't think that's been our problem. I think there are a lot of people who do understand that a lot of the decisions that have been made by this Tory government were not inevitable. They have done enormous damage to people. And I think it's a very different situation than in 2010, where people had sort of bought the idea that the global financial crash was somehow a result of overspending by the Labour Party. I think the bigger problem is not being the opposition. I think the bigger problem is being the alternative, and that's what we've lacked for some time. And that's why, for all the jokes and all the mocking about this very lengthy pamphlet that Keir has just penned, I think it's really important, because that's the only way we ever win elections, is when we convince people that another future is possible.
And that starts this weekend with this vote to change the way you elect leaders in future to electoral college from one member, one vote. If Keir Starmer loses that vote, is that a disaster? Will he resign? Can he get through that?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a sort of Armageddon, will he resign? Is the sky going to fall in? No, I don't think so at all. He's right to take the first opportunity that he's had to make sure that we've got the right processes in the party so that we can turn outwards to the country. He's had a lot of flack for it, but actually this is the first chance, because we have to vote through rule changes at conference, and we haven't had one since he became leader. He's trying to do two things. He's trying to make sure that the way we elect leaders is rooted in the interests of the people of this country. And the unfortunate consequence of the rule changes last time was that it disenfranchised around 2 million trade unionists who, don't pay enormously close attention to Labour politics and didn't opt into the system. And they're important to us. So I think there's an argument for saying this is the right thing to do. But he's also trying to make sure as well that we end the kind of slightly odd system that Jeremy Corbyn introduced that was about trying to make it easier to get rid of your Labour MP. My example was fairly typical. I think we spent 3 months going through a very onerous process with 800 members, and only 6 in the end turned out to say they wanted to reopen the process. So you're overwhelmingly reselected at the end, but we spent the 3 months in the run-up to the election doing that. I strongly suspect that if we'd been able to turn outwards, then I wouldn't be sitting here as a Labour MP in a borough that's returned Labour MPs for 100 years, looking out to a sea of blue. It seems to me that there is a good argument for why this is in the interests of the members, the party, the country, and we should deal with that so that we can move on.
And improve things for your supporters. I mean, it's in no one's interest to have the Tories in power for 50 years. I mean, you have to have an electable Labour Party, I think, as the main opposition. I mean, and that hasn't happened, I would say, for 10 years. And that's got to change.
But also, you've got to have a Labour Party that's relentlessly focused on what's happening in the country. And for my members, I think that's exactly what we've been for the last 10 years. We've been, if you walk around Wigan, you'll find people running credit unions, food banks, you name it, we're there. And it's always members of the Labour Party who are involved in those things. We're very rooted in the community, but you wouldn't know that from listening to some of the debates that we have, certainly on social media.
Quite.
And that's got to change.
Does Keir Starmer need someone from the left to stand up this weekend and say, comrades, we have to get round this, we have to get back into government, this is the way back, because we need to be relevant to the country and face the country with an opportunity here? John Prescott did the same in the early 90s. Is that person Angela Rayner this time? And do you need that person, or can you get through it without that support from the left?
Well, I think he has got support from Ange, but I mean, I sort of think this conversation about the left is kind of weird, because to the public, they just look at us and think there's barely a piece of paper to put between you on most of these issues, and somehow or other we've got to get away from this factional warfare. I do feel to the public it just looks very odd indeed.
And embracing the New Labour's record. I had Peter Mandelson on this podcast last week. I'm sure you've heard it. He was interesting about embracing New Labour and not disowning it. He thought that, that idea of moving into the middle ground, maybe even trying to appeal to Telegraph readers, is where the votes are.
The job is to try to convince and persuade people. If you want to change things for people, they can't afford to wait for you to hang on to your purity. They want you to go out and actually make that change in the world by convincing people. Where I think I disagree with Peter is not on whether we should be proud of game-changing interventions like the education maintenance allowance and investment in health and education. Of course we should. And the minimum wage, which Ian McCartney, my predecessor here in Wigan, championed and pushed through Parliament. I mean, that was genuinely life-changing for a lot of people here. That doesn't mean an uncritical embrace of everything that New Labour does, and it certainly doesn't mean partying like it's 1999. I mean, the world has changed and people have changed, and they're looking for something different from Labour.
Lisa Nandy, I'm just checking, you are going to this weekend's conference, aren't you?
I am. Yeah, I'm going for the full whack.
Why can't Rosie Duffield go?
Well, I hope she can. One of the things that Keir said is that we will not stand for a situation in which any politician, particularly female politicians who have been really, in the firing line from the sort of nasty, divisive politics we've seen, the discourse that we've seen creep into our politics, not just Labour politics, but across the board. He's absolutely determined to make sure that it is a safe place for people to come and have decent debates. She said that she's not going at the moment, and I think that is a real problem. It cannot be right and it cannot stand that people feel intimidated or that their own personal safety would be compromised by doing it. We've got to make sure that people can feel that they can debate in a safe, respectful way. And I have to say that this is no criticism of Rosie, but I have been really concerned as well about the turn that debate has taken on social media. We've got a lot of trans young people in our party. I've got trans young people in my constituency, and they are amongst the most discriminated group in this country. I think we'll look back in history and be ashamed of how we've treated them. And we've got to do better in terms of the debates that we have.
You're speaking at the conference, aren't you, of course, as Shadow Foreign Secretary. What's your big idea? Would you be adopting an ethical foreign policy like Robin Cook talked about in the late 90s? Is that where you sit? Or is it more pragmatic?
Robin's speech has been much mischaracterised over the years, but when he talked about a foreign policy with an ethical dimension, it was very radical. I remember reading it as a teenager and feeling really inspired. Those challenges are different now, of course, and the rise of China is a far greater challenge than anything we've dealt with before. This is a country that's committing genocide against its own people in Xinjiang. But without the active engagement of its government, we are unable to make progress on climate change or COVID-19 or any of those things. So there's a fresh set of challenges that we've got to confront, and just simply embracing the frameworks of the past isn't going to cut it. That's not me saying that Labour's ditching an ethical foreign policy. It's saying that we've got to deal with the world as it is now, and the world that we will inherit in 2024 is fundamentally different from 1997. I think the biggest challenge facing us now is that foreign policy is domestic. The problems that I see in my constituency are problems that are felt locally but can only be solved globally. And yet there is very little in the way of consent for the actions and activities of governments overseas, because we have treated foreign policy as an elite, distant prospect, not connected to the ordinary lives of people in towns across this country. And that has got to change. And I'll be setting out a bit more at conference about how a Labour government would change that.
And Lisa Nandy, you mentioned there the fact you did stand in the leadership campaign against Keir Starmer.
Don't remind me.
Has that ship sailed for Lisa Nandy? Do you still want to be leader?
I think that ship sailed in April when Keir won a huge majority, and I very much welcomed accepting the job as his Shadow Foreign Secretary. The job I am after belongs currently to Liz Truss, and I'd just say to her, don't get too comfortable, because I am absolutely determined that in a few years' time we're going to have somebody, me, in that job who is capable of standing up for the interests of people in this country on a world stage. That's what I want to see. And
just the record then, you never want to lead the Labour Party?
I mean, sometimes when I look back on that contest, it went on for what felt like years and ended with a global pandemic. I sort of wonder what I was thinking in the first place. But actually, it was important, I think, for the party that stood, because in the end, what you saw, I think, was a consensus across me, Keir and Becky, that we had to turn outwards to the country. We had to start dealing with the concerns of people who felt that Labour had been moving away from them for decades. If I was able to give them a voice in that contest, which I hope that I was, I think that I've done the Labour Party a favour and hopefully the country a favour too. And when you look at what Keir's saying this week, I think you'll see that he gets it, he understands it, and he's going to go out and be their champion. I think I launched that campaign by saying, I've listened and I've heard you, and I'll make it my mission to bring Labour home to you. And that's what we're going to Brighton to do this week, is to show that together as a team, a strong, united team, we're going to bring Labour back home to those people.
Well, Lisa Nandy, best of luck with your conference, and thank you for joining us for this week's Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Well, some very interesting points there from the Shadow Foreign Secretary, notably on patriotism and why Labour haven't yet scored any real points or made a mark in the polls against the Tories. But I'd love to hear what you think. Please email us. We're chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or find us on Twitter. We're @chopperspodcast. Right, don't go anywhere. In just one moment, I'll be joined by the leader of the DUP, Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, to ask him why he's written to the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi. Right after this.
Nigel Farage.
This is the most commonest thing done by any government in my lifetime in this country.
Lionel Shriver.
Which is worse, Biden's not being in control and Biden being in control?
Charles Moore.
I think if people in general feel that their traditions, culture, history, values, etc. are under assault, they are basically right.
My name is Stephen Edgington, and if you're enjoying this podcast, you might like Off Script, a new series from The Telegraph. Provocative conversations with provocative individuals. Each episode I sit down with a world-leading commentator to unpick the ongoing culture wars. Unfiltered, unscripted, and full of free speech. Be sure to listen to Off Script in the same place you're listening to this, and make sure to follow so you don't miss an episode.
Now, time to return to a favourite subject here on Choppers Politics. That is, of course, the B word, Brexit. Now, concerns in Northern Ireland rumble on this week about the way the Northern Ireland Protocol, agreed between the UK and EU when we left the European Union, is being applied. And even US President Joe Biden issued a warning of his own to Boris Johnson ahead of their talks in the Oval Office this week. Now, Mr Biden seems to be urging the Prime Minister not to rip up the Northern Ireland Protocol, which keeps the Irish land border open by imposing checks on goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This has, of course, angered unionists. So who better to discuss those issues than with the leader of the DUP, Sir Jeffrey Donaldson? I started by asking Sir Jeffrey Donaldson whether he remembers these words from the Prime Minister before the election in 2019.
Yes, one question. Yeah. Can I go back to my company in the morning and tell my staff we will not be filling in any customs declarations for goods leaving Northern Ireland to go to GB?
You can. And if somebody asks you to do that, tell them to ring up the Prime Minister and I will direct them to throw that form in the bin. There will be no forms, no checks, no barriers of any kind. You will have unfettered access.
Boris Johnson there, no forms, no checks, no barriers of any kind. He offered that person there before the election in 2019, Jeffrey Donaldson, said, give me a ring, any problems? Well, there are problems, and are you giving him a ring?
Yes, we certainly are, Chris. We've been engaging with the government now since this protocol was imposed back in January this year. Indeed, long before that, we warned of the consequences of the protocol and the harm that it would do not only to Northern Ireland's economic position and our trade with the rest of the UK, our biggest market, but also the political harm it would do, the instability it would create. And so it has come to pass, and we're now looking to the Prime Minister to honour the commitments he gave previously. It is essential, if we're to restore political stability in Northern Ireland, that the government lives up to its promises.
Jeffrey Donaldson, you heard President Joe Biden talk this week about his concerns about the peace process because of Brexit.
On the protocols, I feel very strongly about those. We spent an enormous amount of time and effort in the United States. It was a major bipartisan effort made, and I would not at all like to see, nor I might add, would many of my Republican colleagues like to see a change in the Irish courts, the end result having a closed border again.
Was that intervention helpful?
I think it is useful that the Prime Minister is able to acquaint President Biden with the complexity of this issue, because I think at times Washington takes a very simplistic view. We need to support the Good Friday Agreement, but they tend to look at that through the prism of Irish America from a nationalist perspective, and sometimes not recognising that actually a peace agreement is between two sides, not one. And that one of those sides is unionism. And if unionism is not happy with the current situation, as we most certainly are not, if unionism feels that the protocol is harming the agreement and the political institutions, then Washington needs to recognise that we need to find a solution to remove this Irish sea border, because it has altered the very delicate constitutional balance that is represented by the agreement, and unionists are certainly not going to accept that as a way forward. And so I think Washington needs to recognise that the protocol is causing the harm, not offering the solution.
What's the US up to? Do you think their goal is a united Ireland?
Well, I'm not so sure that they go so far as that. In latter years, Washington has been careful to try and take a more balanced view, recognising that the principle of consent means it's for the people of Northern Ireland to take this decision. However, the protocol actually harms and undermines the principle of consent. And that's the point here, Chris. Northern Ireland's status as part of the United Kingdom has been altered by this protocol, and altered without the consent of the people of Northern Ireland. Now, for unionists, that is a major issue, and one that needs to be addressed alongside addressing the trade issues and the problems that have been created by this protocol, which mean that as part of the United Kingdom, we can't trade properly with the rest of our own country.
You wrote to Nancy Pelosi, the US House of Representatives Speaker, this week, didn't you? So what was that for? You're trying to bring in the House, are you, to support you in your attempt to try and get this sorted out?
Yes, I think that, where people have this misperception that somehow the protocol underpins the Good Friday Agreement, that it's there to protect the political institutions, we need to challenge that, because it is evident that the protocol is harming the political institutions. It's undermining political stability in Northern Ireland, and it's harming our economy. Peace and prosperity are twins. They go hand in hand. And the protocol is harming the prospect of Northern Ireland prospering in terms of our economy. It's harming our relationship with the rest of the UK. And that's why I think when people like Speaker Pelosi make comments that are, to be honest, lying to the concerns of unionists, then I think we're right to challenge that.
Back to Boris Johnson's comments there at the start of our interview. Do you blame the EU for the way these checks are being carried out? Certainly the GB side tell us that it's the checks being forced on them or being done by the European Union, which is creating this sea border, which you don't want. So do you blame Brussels or London?
Well, look, in the end, both signed up to the protocol. And these things were evident at the time. We warned in Parliament that this would result in checks, unnecessary, unacceptable checks on the movement of goods within the UK internal market. And you will recall that in fairness to the Prime Minister, they did introduce clauses to the UK Internal Markets Bill to try and prevent that from happening, but then withdrew those clauses when they signed up to the protocol. So yes, the EU are forcing this. Yes, I think the EU are using a sledgehammer to crack a nut when it comes to enforcing and imposing these checks, which I believe are unnecessary. But it's the government, our own government, that needs to protect the integrity of the UK internal market, and they need to take the action to do that.
Do you want all checks to disappear between GB and Northern Ireland? Because even people I speak to in the Northern Ireland office, they say there was a degree of checks on meat and animals going between GB and Northern Ireland, even in the old days. So do you accept there needs to be a degree of checks just because of the two different land masses?
Well, the checks that occurred pre the protocol, of course, would remain in place. That's not what the EU are demanding. They want a prohibition on the movement of chilled meats, for example, from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, which means Northern Ireland people could no longer buy sausages or burgers or other chilled meat products from a supplier in Great Britain. And we just think that is entirely unacceptable. We have an increasing number of English, Scottish and Welsh businesses who are just coming to the conclusion it's too difficult to do business in Northern Ireland and are closing off their supply chains. I have one of our largest independent retail groups in Northern Ireland who tell me that their access to product lines from their main supplier in Great Britain has been slashed by 50% in the last 2 weeks alone. This is having a major impact on our economy, and that's why we need this sorted out quickly.
I heard that also there was a kind of backdoor EU backstop starting to emerge, with the European Union imposing rules on businesses in Northern Ireland, which then are not applicable in GBs. Is that right?
It is right, Chris, and the longer that kind of divergence continues, the more the harm the protocol does to Northern Ireland, and it becomes more deeply rooted, which is why I think there is a degree of urgency here, and it's why I've sought to focus minds on getting solutions, on restoring Northern Ireland's place within the UK internal market, and to prevent this kind of divergence. It is entirely unacceptable that one part of the United Kingdom should be separated by an Irish Sea border from the rest of the United Kingdom at the behest of the European Union.
What's the answer, Sir Jeffrey Donaldson? Do you think this Northern Ireland Protocol needs to be ripped up?
I think that the protocol needs to be replaced. I think the Irish Sea border needs to be removed. And I think that Northern Ireland's place within the UK internal market needs to be restored. So what are we looking at to replace the protocol? Well, I think it is entirely possible to put in place arrangements that protect and respect the integrity of the UK internal market, that require no checks on goods that are moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and remaining within the UK market, and differentiating between those and goods that are being sold into the European Union. And I think we can come to practical arrangements that satisfy the EU that the integrity of their market is protected, but that does not require and should not require and must not require an Irish Sea border within the United Kingdom.
Are you not saying there, Jeffrey Donaldson, there needs to be a degree of a border on the island of Ireland, which is exactly what Joe Biden said he didn't want to see?
Well, none of us are advocating that, and the UK government has made clear, as have we, that doesn't need to be the solution. There is today the technology and the systems, and I've talked to customs experts, I've talked to large technological companies who tell me there are systems in place that can monitor the movement of goods from the point of origin to the point of arrival without the need for physical checks on a land border. Therefore, that is why the Irish Sea border is a nonsense. It is not required. It is unnecessary. And the sooner it is removed, the better.
Will we see change by Christmas?
I am hopeful that we're going to see real progress being made. The UK government has issued in its command paper in July a clear direction of travel that I think would go a long way to resolving these issues. And what we need now is for the government to act upon the commitments they've already made. I'm not asking the government to do anything more than they've already said they would do, Chris. I'm simply asking them to honour their word.
Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, the DUP's leader, thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I'm going to pose a question to you listeners. What do you think upset France more this week? A submarine deal agreed between the UK, US and Australia, which cut out France. It's known as the AUKUS deal. Or our Prime Minister's deliberate butchering of their language.
I just think it's time for some of our dearest friends around the world to prenez un grip about all this, and donnez-moi un break. Because this
a
is
fine example of the very best franglais there, uttered by our Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And no surprises, it hasn't quite helped de-escalate the row between Paris and London. France is clearly furious about being blindsided by the pact between the US, Australia and UK. This week, former Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt wrote a piece in the Daily Telegraph about the fallout, headlined "The French can't have their cake and eat it." So I thought I'd give Jeremy Hunt a ring and ask him to donnez-moi his take on it. Jeremy Hunt, welcome back to Choppers Politics. Politics de Chopper.
Pleasure, Chris.
You wrote a piece this week saying the French can't have their cake and eat it about this AUKUS deal, this nuclear deal with the UK, Australia and America. And how you define that you gave a French expression, didn't you?
Yes, I did. It was a phrase that was told to me by our brilliant former ambassador, Ed Llewellyn. And he said, look, this is the French phrase for have your cake and eat it.
On ne peut avoir le beurre et l'argent du beurre, which means you can't have the butter and the money from selling it.
Exactly. So this phrase of Boris's had obviously sunk deep in France. And so this phrase was constantly repeated to me. But I do feel now it's time to say the same thing back to the French. And the reason is very straightforward, which is that if you're saying we want a deep relationship, a partnership, a friendship with our closest geographical ally, you can't dissect a relationship and say we're going to be very, very close here, but we're going to be rivals here and we're going to be unfriendly here. It just doesn't work like that. And at the moment, following Brexit, when it comes to economic relations, we have basically an unfriendly relationship. We have the EU, at French insistence, making life very difficult on the Northern Irish border, when there are perfectly sensible solutions that would make sure that the border between North and South doesn't become an inadvertent way to breach the single market, which is the worry. We could sort all those things out, but by holding out, what they are basically doing is saying they want restrictions on trade between mainland UK and Northern Ireland to be the punishment for Brexit, the price we pay for Brexit. And that's just not acceptable. And at the same time as saying that, they're saying we want to have the closest possible security relationship. And it just doesn't work like that. Either we're going to have a grown-up post-Brexit relationship with give and take, in which we both recognise that we are similar-sized countries with a global footprint that can benefit from working together. Or you say we're going to go our own separate ways and we'll become part of the Anglo-Saxon world and you can be part of the continental European world. Now, the great irony is that the one thing the French said time after time to me when I was Foreign Secretary is, we don't want you to disappear off into the Anglo-Saxon bloc. We want you to remain a European power integrated with us on defence and foreign policy because we have so many shared values.
And that was post-Brexit, that period?
Yes. And they said, but we don't want that to happen. But the way they're behaving is pushing us more and more into the arms of what they would call it, the Anglo-Saxons. And, I'm someone who believes we should have a close relationship with continental European countries, but we need a real change in tone to make that possible.
So Boris Johnson was right to say, donnez-moi un break.
Well, I think he is trying to keep the door open. But, we do have our red lines. It might sound strange that I'm sticking up for him, having stood against him in the leadership campaign, but I do think he's right to say, look, Brexit has happened. We are never going to compromise on the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom. There has to be flexibility, therefore, on the Northern Irish border issue. And let's just leave all that stuff and look at the big picture in the world, which is working together on climate change, taking a common line on China, where actually not just us, Australia and America, but also France and Germany have a huge amount in common.
Just you and me talking, Jeremy. The secret delight, isn't it, of the Foreign Office is winding up the French, right? I mean, it's just fun. It's just fun, isn't it? It's basically a bit of a sport.
I don't actually think that's true. And I think I'm not saying at all that there isn't a kind of schadenfreude on both sides of the channel. There is that historic rivalry that's gone on for so long. And there's been a French view that Brexit is going to be a disaster for the UK. They all say it's not good for Europe as well, in fairness. And I think that they need to move on from that mindset because we're going to make a great success of it. And I think that's becoming clearer. But inside the Foreign Office, I think generally, in fairness, people want to have the closest possible relationship with major powers with whom we share a lot in common.
And do you think this AUKUS deal is the first dividend of Brexit, do you think? Or could it have happened when we're in the European Union?
It could easily have happened when we were in the European Union. But I think that what is interesting is that Brexit may have created a context for those discussions, which meant that the initial first step in that alliance did not include France. I think it would be a great thing if in the future France could be part of that alliance.
They can join it.
Exactly. But if you look at what, President Macron has been saying for a long time, he's been saying he wants Europe to have a defense capability and responsibilities independent of the United States. So he is the one who's been trying to say he wants to move away from closer links to the United States. So I think the French have got to make their mind up on that.
And this will blow over soon, do you think, or will it be a lingering problem with Paris-London relations?
I think there's a lot of things that have got to be worked through, to use a kind of putting my health hat on, a psychiatrist might say. There's a lot of issues here that have got to be worked through. But if President Macron is re-elected next year, I think that probably both sides will say, OK, now we are going to be together for a long time and let's try and work things out. But I'm not sure much will happen before then.
How would you judge Boris Johnson's last 4 days? He's dominated the news, isn't he? With all sorts of remarks, not least how many children he has. We know that for sure now. It's 6. Other things too, though, about how he sees the world, the deal he's got on the environment ahead of COP26. I mean, how would you rate, give him marks out of 10 for the past 4 days?
Well, I think 8 out of 10. I think he's had a pretty good few days. Here's the interesting thing, Chris. There we were in August, saying that what has happened in Afghanistan was a catastrophe for the West. And here we are in September with the new Australia, US, UK Defence Pact, and suddenly things feel very different. And if there is someone who is a master at changing the mood in politics, it's Boris.
This trade deal wasn't signed. I mean, it was never expected to be signed. That's a blow for Brexit hopes.
Yeah, I think we would have liked a trade deal. That was the one thing that the Trump administration was extremely enthusiastic about. I don't think we would kid ourselves that it would have been easy to negotiate. The Americans are very, very tough negotiators. I'm sure overall the government is disappointed that we're not going to be progressing on that anytime soon. But I think there's probably another part of Boris Johnson's brain that's saying, but it would have been quite a nightmare persuading people to open up the UK to American agricultural imports, for example.
Totally. And you think it would be a series of side deals going forward now, do you think, as they work towards some formal agreement in the future?
Potentially. There's momentum in terms of our trade deals. I think you can overstate the importance of trade deals in terms of the success of the British economy. In the end, it is whether we are making products and offering services other people want to buy. And trade deals help that at the margins. But the fundamental thing is, are you making products competitively?
And Jeremy Hunt, just finally, you're now the last Foreign Secretary but one. You've got some perspective on being a Foreign Secretary. What's your advice for Liz Truss, just a week into her job?
It does make you feel very ancient if you're not just talking about your successor, you're talking about your successor.
You look younger than ever, though, on this Zoom call.
Thank you. That's so kind of you, Chris. You know, get people to take part in your podcasts, don't you? What I would say is that it is so easy in those very, very challenging jobs, and I know better than anyone, I think, the pressures in those jobs. It is very easy to spend your life firefighting. As Foreign Secretary, every morning you have a piece of paper on your desk asking you to make a mini decision about something that might be happening in Yemen or Moscow. And the truth is there is always a risk that you end up getting sucked into firefighting over small issues in a way that means you don't make progress on the big strategic issues. And I remember what Kissinger said to me, the good foreign ministers are people who can rise above the short-term firefighting and embrace the bigger strategic changes that are happening in the world.
Well, Jeremy Hunt, some good advice there for Liz Truss, and thank you for joining us today on Choppers Politics. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Pleasure.
And a link to Jeremy's article on this subject will be in the show notes to this episode. Well, that's all for this week, listeners. But don't fret. You can get more news and expert analysis by going to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where you'll get your first month's access to our content completely free of charge. And after that, the next 3 months is just £1 a month. Thank you to my guests, Lisa Nandy, Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, and of course, Jeremy Hunt. Thank you as well to my brilliant team of producers, Louisa Wells, Giles Gear, and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. And don't forget, you can get more insights from me every lunchtime now, delivered straight to your email inbox in the form of my Choppers Politics newsletter. Go to telegraph.co.uk/newsletters to sign up. And finally, if you can, please do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. It's a great read and you won't regret it. Until next time, though, cheerio!